Bruce Willis, along with Maddie and his Emmy, indulges in a little more moonlighting on BBC Two shortly. Blackadder the Third provides our entertainment in half an hour, entering the golden age of English literature in the company of the likes of Byron and Shelley. And that's here on BBC One.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martyn Lewis and Andrew Harvey.
The worst ever monthly trade figures send shares tumbling by £6 billion.
The guns that fired 119 shots in Hungerford, the story of Michael Ryan's last day.
A bittersweet day for the spy catcher. The British government will go all the way to stop his book in Australia.
The United Nations on trial. Sir Geoffrey says its very credibility and effectiveness are now at stake.
And more floods threaten Bangladesh. Can they build defences against the disease that will follow? Good evening. Britain's trade with the rest of the world was almost £1 billion in the red last month, 700 million more than had been expected. It shocked the city, fuelling fears of rising inflation and higher interest rates. But the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, said it was dangerous to look at 1 month in isolation. The economy is doing well, he said. There is no reason to believe we are off track. The Shadow Trade Secretary, Brian Gould, disagreed. The figures are, he said, the worst on record, and the outlook for British industry is grim. It certainly alarmed the dealers who buy and sell shares in the city when the news was flashed on their screens at 11:30 this morning. Over the next 3 hours, prices were slashed again and again, sending the 100-share index plummeting 49 points and wiping £6,000 million off share values. At one point, the computers flashed signs indicating that shares were falling so fast the prices might not be up to date. And the FT 100 still ended down 39 points. Foreign exchange dealers took a more robust view, and the pound stayed firm, losing less than half a cent on the day.
August is often a wicked month for the trade figures. This year's was no exception. In high-spending Britain, imports continued to rise, but exports started to fall off because the pound was stronger and other countries were buying less as world trade slowed down. The result, the gap between exports and imports of visible manufactured goods and raw materials widened to a record £1.5 billion plus. It was balanced by the invisible contribution of banking, insurance, shipping and so on, which brought in profits of 600 millions, but still left another record gap of 929 millions. British high streets are now booming faster than almost anywhere else. As a result, imports of almost every kind were on the increase in August. Another £100 million worth of cars coming in to replace those sold under the E-registration. An extra £100 million worth of consumer goods, keeping the high street boom going, with favourites like microwaves and dishwashers now almost entirely imported. But also big increases in capital goods. That's machinery to make our factories more modern, plus extra raw materials to fuel them. Labour's trade spokesman was horrified, but the Chancellor stayed unruffled.
These figures are truly appalling. They're the worst monthly figures ever recorded, and they show very clearly that we are now trading at a substantial loss. In other words, according to the most important single criterion of how we're doing as an economy, we're doing very badly indeed.
I think it's always dangerous to look at 1 month in isolation. So far, for the year as a whole, the deficit is of the order of £750 million against a budget forecast of £2.5 billion deficit. So there's no reason to believe that we're off track.
Britain's trade performance is somewhere in the middle of the industrial nations. In the first half of this year, Japan had a huge £30,000 million surplus. West Germany was £13,000 million in the black. At that time, Britain was still £37 million to the good, but France was already £600 million in the red, while the United States had a huge £48,000 million deficit. In America, the figures are a live political issue. Today's huge British trade gap makes sure that they're back on the political agenda here, too.
An inquest jury in Hungerford has been given the first detailed picture of the private world of Michael Ryan. Last month, Ryan shot and killed 16 people before turning a gun on himself. The jury was told he was obsessed with guns and even took them to work with him. He threatened to shoot 2 workmates who teased him. The jury also heard he had few friends but was spoiled by his mother, who became one of his victims.
The jury was shown the 3 guns with which Ryan killed 15 people and himself in Hungerford, a pistol, a carbine, and the Chinese-made Kalashnikov he obtained legally with a £50 deposit. The full price was £310. He'd also bought for it 300 rounds of armour-piercing military ammunition imported from Hungary. This afternoon, the inquest heard of the extraordinary comparisons between Michael Ryan's normally polite, respectful, even introverted character and the carnage he eventually visited upon a quiet housing estate. The local community policeman described him as extremely polite, a seemingly fit and proper person to hold a firearms certificate. Gun dealers and gun shop assistants and an official of the gun club to which he belonged, all of them described him as quiet, rational and sensible. But there was evidence of his dark side too. His aunt gave evidence, and she said about him, he seemed fascinated by guns. They played a big part in his life. His father was a big man, and it seemed that having a gun gave him that power. And Mr. Charles Amor, who was in charge of Ryan's work as a labourer for a government improvement scheme, described how Ryan turned up with loaded guns in the boot of his car, boasting that he carried a Beretta pistol in his waistband at all times for protection and shot holes in traffic signs for target practice. He told Ryan not to bring guns to work again. And a detective chief superintendent told the inquest in a shot-by-shot account of his murderous progress through the housing estate how Ryan first of all shot his next-door neighbours and after setting fire to his house walked calmly through the streets, shooting at people on the pavements, in gardens and in passing cars. He killed a policeman by raking his car with gunfire and broke into a house to shoot dead a man and his wife in their own kitchen. Finally, in the classroom of the school that he once attended as a pupil, he was found dead, shot through the head with a Beretta pistol he tied to his wrist with a lanyard.
The government is to continue its long battle to prevent Peter Wright's book Spycatcher being published in Australia. Early today, judges in New South Wales ruled that the ban on the book's publication should be lifted and the government should pay all Mr. Wright's costs. A few hours later, Downing Street said they would appeal and take the case to the highest court in Australia.
A majority ruling by 2 of the 3 judges bluntly rejected the Crown's appeal. In the most forceful statement of all, Mr. Justice Kirby pointed out the secrets of Peter Wright's book Spycatcher are already out. This refers to the publication of the book in America. In a minority judgment, the Chief Justice, Sir Lawrence Street, said it's up to the Australian government to produce fresh, up-to-date evidence that publication here would harm Australian national interest. So it's an important victory for Peter Wright's solicitor, Malcolm Turnbull.
We're very happy about the judgment. It's a good result, and we're very pleased.
I think it's a very important point of principle that we still want to see observed and upheld, which is Mr. Wright's obligation of confidentiality, and we think that is an important principle.
The Crown is well and truly up against it, facing huge legal bills and action for damages by Peter Wright. Later, we flew 800 miles to Tasmania, where spring flowers are budding outside what Peter Wright calls his shack.
I thought there was a 50-50 chance we might win.
Do you think that this struggle, this saga, is going to go to Canberra? Do you foresee it dragging on for another year?
Oh, yeah. Those bastards will never give up. And that's how I refer to them.
It seems a bittersweet moment for you tonight.
I am not bitter about it. Quite definitely not. But I'm very concerned that most people in Britain don't seem to understand why I've done it, why I've done what I've done. I have not done anything to hurt Britain at all, and let them prove it.
Here, opposition leaders and some Conservative backbenchers are questioning the cost of the government's action, and some feel the government should give up its fight now that the book has become a bestseller in those countries where it is freely available.
Spycatcher was published in the United States in July. As soon as it hit the bookstands, people started buying the book to bring across the Atlantic. And with Her Majesty's Customs taking no action, one informed source says so many copies have now arrived, it should already qualify as a bestseller in this country as well. Whatever happens now, Spycatcher is already a massive commercial success. It's been #1 for 9 weeks on the United States bestseller lists, with 535,000 copies sold and more being printed. And it's also been #1 in Canada for 9 weeks, where it's been the country's fastest-selling non-fiction book ever, with 85,000 sold and more on the way. With gross sales of 620,000, that represents a tidy income for author Peter Wright of almost £1 million in royalties. As for the cost to the British government, the lowest estimate is £250,000 so far, but some lawyers reckon the final bill could be £2 million or higher. The government should cut their losses now, says Labour's George Foulkes.
It has been published, and pursuing the action any further brings the government into increasing ridicule and contempt, not just in Australia, but in public opinion throughout the world.
Backbench Tory MP Jonathan Aitken says to continue would only increase the expense and humiliation. But other Conservatives say the government should persist.
Common sense means that we must preserve our national secrets. It's no use having a secret service which cannot preserve its own secrets against the world. And so the British government has no option but to continue this action, and even after any adverse judgment, which I do not expect in Australia, to maintain it elsewhere.
A man has been killed and a second man injured in 2 separate shootings in Northern Ireland. Police believe the dead man may have been a victim of mistaken identity. He was shot while driving through Newry in County Down. He's thought to have had no connections with the security forces. In the second shooting, a part-time soldier in the Ulster Defence Regiment was ambushed on his way to work. His injuries aren't thought to be serious, and 4 men have since been arrested. The head of social workers in the Strathclyde region of Scotland has admitted his department made serious errors in a case in which a 20-month-old baby was battered to death. The baby's stepfather was sentenced to life imprisonment today for her murder. The director of social work, Fred Edwards, admitted his department had been tipped off twice that the baby was in danger. They'd decided, after visiting her home, that no further action was needed.
Britain's Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, says the United Nations must face up to its responsibilities over the Gulf War. He's calling on the Soviet Union to support an arms embargo against Iran, a move which was reinforced tonight by President Reagan. America's Secretary of State, George Shultz, is meeting his Soviet counterpart, Mr. Shevardnadze, at this moment. In the Gulf, another merchant ship has been sunk by a mine near Farsi Island. It happened on Tuesday night, but was only reported when 3 survivors were rescued. 4 of the crew are missing, presumed dead.
The Gulf rhetoric varies little outside and inside the United Nations. The different factions remain far apart, and the British delegation questions whether this world body is up to the task it faces.
The issue this week is the United Nations itself, its credibility, its effectiveness, and the capacity of the Security Council to face up to its responsibilities.
The record on that score is mixed. The smiling Iranians have ignored the ceasefire resolution, and the Security Council is unsure what to do about it. Britain's view that an arms embargo must be imposed, not now, but urgently.
It is going to be a difficult, exacting, and quite possibly long task to move to the next stage. What we are determined to do is to sustain the pressure for and progress in the right direction.
The Iranians call the UN a nice-looking card house and a paper factory issuing worthless and ineffective orders. If the Security Council can't agree on an arms embargo, some officials fear that those descriptions may be proved entirely accurate. Much depends on the Russians, for they still talk to both sides in the Gulf War. Their foreign minister met the US Secretary of State just over an hour ago. In public, he's non-committal on an arms embargo, but much more is being said in private, and it's on those discussions that the outcome will depend. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in New York.
The Russians, for their part, have been urging the United Nations to set up a peacekeeping force in the Gulf. Some European countries are in favour. Today, the Foreign Office here said it wasn't opposed in principle, but there were too many practical problems.
The Royal Navy's minesweepers have now begun working in earnest in one of the main approaches to the Gulf. Trailing behind them, floats attached to cables to drag mines up to the surface to be destroyed. 4 ships are involved, a small element of the estimated 70 warships now assembled in the Gulf region. The French are there in strength, and other European navies are on their way. They're trying to coordinate, but no one's in overall charge. And now there are calls for a UN force to be set up instead. If it was, it would be the first United Nations force at sea. UN members have long cooperated on land. The peacekeeping force in the Lebanon is one of 5 at work now, most in the Middle East. But Britain remains sceptical that such a force could work in the Gulf.
We've never objected to this idea in principle, but we've never felt it was practical. And I'm afraid we still think that too many countries would have to change their approach, and there are too many logistical problems and negotiations that would have to be carried on for this to really be a practical proposition.
The most obvious of the practical problems would be communications, with differences in language and radio equipment. The tactics used by each navy are different. Supplies may not be compatible, which could prove awkward. And hardest of all, perhaps, would be choosing who'd be in command. But some experts believe these problems could be overcome, and that a UN force would prove very effective.
If you had a force that had the endorsement of a UN resolution, and which was supported by both the superpowers and by the Security Council as a whole, that would be something which would be much harder for the Iranians to totally ignore.
On exercise in the Channel last month, NATO countries showed how they overcame national differences. Now there's diplomatic pressure to try the same but far harder task of coordinating a world force in the Gulf.
A cigarette is thought to have caused an explosion which killed a crewman on board a ship in the Philippines. Another man is missing, presumed drowned, after the vessel caught fire off Manila. 16 others were injured. It took more than 2 hours to bring the flames under control. The ship was carrying highly explosive chemicals. 2 barges moored alongside also caught fire.
The South African government have denied that there's been a military coup in the black tribal homeland of Transkei. The Homeland Army were reported to have seized power while the Prime Minister was out of the country. But the South Africans say they've been assured the Transkei administration is continuing as normal.
The Prime Minister has arrived in West Berlin for a conference of conservative leaders from all over the world. It's the first time they've met since the agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union on intermediate nuclear weapons. One subject high on the agenda is likely to be the future of Europe without such weapons.
In a distant corner of Bavaria today, the French President and the German Chancellor came to observe a small but historic moment. On a bridge over the not very blue Danube, they've been pooling their forces and holding a joint exercise, and the German commander briefly did things the French way. The nucleus of a European defence force had been created, just in case it might ever be needed. In West Berlin, where the political leaders of France, Germany and Britain were about to assemble for their first meeting since the superpowers agreed to get rid of medium-range nuclear weapons in Europe, nothing seemed to have changed much. The old East-West suspicion seemed as strong as ever. And yet the agreement between Moscow and Washington has brought a touch of nervousness to every Western European member of NATO. Supposing the agreement goes further, they're asking themselves, and the American nuclear guarantee to Europe might one day be cancelled. What then? In the unlikely company of leaders of conservative parties from all over the world, the conservative leaders of Western Europe were gathering to discuss all this. Chancellor Kohl, as host, is distinctly nervous that taking nuclear weapons out of Europe will put West Germany at serious risk. Europe, he says, can't match the huge conventional forces of the Soviet Union. For her part, Mrs. Thatcher is resolutely refusing even to consider that British or French nuclear weapons might be involved in any superpower deal.
We are not talking about a denuclearized Europe in any way. We're talking about that mix of weapons, nuclear and conventional, which will give us a safe defense. The independent nuclear deterrent and the nuclear deterrent for the whole of NATO is vital for the safe defense of Europe.
Even so, as Mrs. Thatcher headed in to meet her other Conservative colleagues, she, like the rest, knew the difficulties of trying to stand out against the superpower tide. And so what would normally be just a run-of-the-mill type of political meeting has taken on a particular significance. And tomorrow, the leaders of Europe, some of the most important of them, will be addressing themselves to the question of the future of European defence. This is John Simpson for the 9 o'clock news in Berlin.
Staff at the Labour Party headquarters in London have decided not to take industrial action over proposed job cuts. They've now cancelled a protest which would have disrupted Labour's annual conference next week. Party leaders say 45 jobs must go to help reduce a huge overdraft.
And the Labour Party has launched a national campaign against government plans for a community charge or poll tax. They say such a system to replace the rates is unfair. Labour admits they have yet to produce an alternative plan, but their environment spokesman, John Cunningham, says he favours reform of the rates rather than abolition.
Clearly, the rating system, as it presently exists, is out of date in a number of aspects and unfair in some other aspects. Of course, we want to see unfairnesses removed and anomalies corrected, but almost every other Western industrial democracy uses a property-based tax as the basis of raising local government revenue.
The government has issued a circular to schools banning sex lessons which advocate homosexuality or suggest it's normal. The controversy was highlighted last year in the row over the availability of a children's book which suggested homosexual relationships were as normal as heterosexual ones.
9 weeks after the first floods in Bangladesh, much of the country is still underwater. It's the worst flooding for 40 years. There's an urgent need for more medical supplies, and now unusually heavy rain is said to be holding up rescue efforts. Officially, about 900 people have died, but aid workers believe the figure is much higher. The worst problem is diarrhea, more than 500,000 cases so far, and more medicine is urgently needed. The latest downpour comes with reports of water escaping from the Farakka River barrage in India. All along the Ganges, communities like Rajhashi have been affected. In all, millions have been made homeless.
They'd hoped the worst was over, but now unexpectedly the rains have come again. Whole families have taken to boats to move to higher ground. Flimsy homes made from bamboo and thatch are still standing just, but all inside has been swept away. Villagers and army relief teams will try anything to stop the muddy water creeping ever higher. But sandbags won't hold back another surge as the freak monsoons of the last few days continue. They're the worst floods for 40 years, and now all they can do is pray.
What we are trying now is a very temporary measure. In case there is 1 or 2 centimeter increase in the water, we'll be able to hold it. But if there is any substantial rise, I would say only God can help us.
This man is one of those who's lost his home, and he's sought refuge where he can. It's only temporary, but there is somewhere for his family, and food too, however basic. Like others, they're getting enough to last them for 4 or 5 days at a time. The Bangladesh government's made an international appeal for food. The response has been encouraging. Pledges made so far should, if kept, be sufficient. There's hunger and hardship, but as yet, nothing like the widespread famines which have followed previous floods in this disaster-prone country. The main threat now is to public health. Contaminated water and rotted food lead inevitably to diarrhea. The authorities warn of the dangers, but they're not always heeded. Germs become more concentrated in the water as the flood subsides. The treatment is a rehydration solution made from salt and sugar, and more of that is desperately needed. Political leaders are mobbed wherever they go. Opposition parties say the relief operation has been too slow, but the Bangladesh president rejects that criticism.
They have said in the beginning that we have failed to meet the challenge of the flood, but we have proved that we have not failed. So far, about 2 months have passed, not a single chap died without food. That's the clear proof that we have been able to meet it.
After the deluge of the past few days, areas which had emerged from the flood are underwater again. It's been a bitter blow, putting back the task of rebuilding the country by weeks, if not months.
John Fryer on the tragedy of Bangladesh. And tonight's main news again. Britain's balance of trade was nearly £1 billion in the red last month, but the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, said the economy is doing well. In the city, share values dropped £6 billion.
The guns Michael Ryan used to shoot 16 people in and around Hungerford have been shown to an inquest jury.
And the government has decided it will carry on its fight to stop Peter Wright's book being published. And that's the national and international news tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Good evening, and now the news from the southeast. Ratepayers from Waltham Forest in East London are considering a further appeal to the House of Lords against a 62% rate rise. They lost their latest case against the increase at the Court of Appeal today. It rejected their argument that the Labour-controlled council's rise was irrational, unreasonable and illegal. Lambeth councillors will give the final go-ahead tomorrow to plans which would cut £60 million from their budget. The council leader, Linda Bellos, has already approved the cost-cutting measures. 18 months ago, the former council leader, Ted Knight, and 30 other members were disqualified for refusing to go along with government plans to reduce spending. They acted outside the law by not setting a legal rate. 17 football fans have been charged with public order offences after trouble at QPR's Loftus Road ground during the match against Millwall last night. All 17 have been remanded on bail. British Rail is spending £39 million on improving services for commuters who use Liverpool Street Station in London. The government has approved BR's plans to buy 30 new trains. There's been a record increase in passengers using the station in the last year. And plans have been unveiled for a £90 million development at Ramsgate Harbour and Pegwell Bay in Kent. A Dutch company wants to double the size of the marina and build a hotel, shops, houses and a leisure complex. A model's going on show in the town and public consultations will have to be held before the development can get the go-ahead. One of London's best-known landmarks, the Albert Memorial, faces demolition because it's in danger of collapsing. The iron core of the 115-year-old monument is disintegrating, and it's estimated that it would cost about £8 million to restore. Well, that's all from the South East Newsroom for tonight. I'll be back again in breakfast time tomorrow morning. But now here's the weather with Ian McCaskill. Good night.
Hello. Now the weather seems to be slowly on the mend. Mind you, it's not getting any warmer. Sandown and Isle of Wight managed to be the warmest place in Britain today with just 19 Celsius, 66 Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, Morecambe, an autumn day to remember, a magnificent 10.6 hours of sunshine. On the satellite sequence, you can see that many of us did have showers during the day, and this large swirl of cloud swept eastwards into France and Spain. That's quite a deep low there, giving windy conditions in Portugal at the moment. Former tropical storm Dennis, it'll move bodily eastwards over the next 2 days, and that's where it's going to be by lunchtime on Saturday. But meanwhile, this lovely area of high pressure will have come along and killed most of our showers off. So although it's not so good for Spain and France, we will certainly be picking up cool, bright, dry weather for most of us right through the weekend. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. We still have showers to contend with over the country at the moment, mainly in the north and west. Most central and eastern areas dry, clear, a few patches of mist, even a touch of ground frost in 1 or 2 spots too. Chiefly, I think, the northern glens, 5 Celsius, is 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, tomorrow, most eastern and southern parts of Britain starting off dry and bright with sunshine at times. There'll be showers, though, in the north and west. Not as many as we've had, not probably as heavy as we've had either, but there will be showers nonetheless from time to time. And those showers breaking out in some eastern and a few southern districts too as we go through the day. But many central and southern parts of England and Wales staying dry right through the day with sunshine at times. Temperatures, well, a little bit on the low side, I'm afraid. 14 is just 57, 17 at best, just 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The winds from the northwest, that's why it's cool, 10 to 15 miles an hour. On Sunday and Saturday, mainly dry, cool, frost at night, but there's a showery summary of tomorrow's weather.
For reasons of good taste, And in the best interest of the BBC, Gordon the Gopher will not be on the cover of the new Radio Times.
Now, that's a very good idea, too.
We agree.
Goodness me. Now, on Saturday, Going Live starts. Very exciting. You're on it?
Yep, and you're on it.
Mhm.
And you could even be on it, too.
But as far as he's concerned, he's going to get the smallest possible part we can find him. In fact, he's not even in the Radio Times.
But in Radio Times, you can discover all about Harry's kingdom and the wicked world of double glazing.
Jilly all right, do you think?
Yes, sure she is. She'll be fine. Makes him feel good if the boss's wife fancies him, right?
Right.
I'll tell you, it's not on, not tonight.
OK, I'll serve you.
Harry.
And meet Pulaski. On screen, he's a hero fighting crime and corruption. But off screen, he's Larry Summers, a heel with a hangover and a not-so-adoring wife.
Mrs. Summers, how does it feel to be the partner both off-screen and on of the legendary Pulaski?
Like having all your eggs in one big basket.
Partners in Crime in the new Radio Times.
BBC Two, in about 15 minutes, sets the scene for the finals of the famous triennial Leeds International Piano Competition, which can be seen on Two over the next 2 nights. We also provide an excursion into the arts here on BBC One now, entering the golden age of English literature with Blackadder the Third.